There is a certain kind of silence that falls over a battlefield just before everything changes. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of anticipation. The held breath of 10,000 men who have just heard, somewhere in the distance, the low, droning call of a military band, unlike anything Europe had ever encountered. And then they appeared, disciplined, immovable, moving as one. They were called the Janissaries, long before the age of standing armies, before the concept of professional soldiery had taken root across much of the Western world. The Ottoman Empire had already perfected something extraordinary, a corps of elite infantry so rigorously trained, so fiercely devoted, and so tactically lethal that for nearly 5 centuries they would define what it meant to be a warrior in the known world. They were not born into their power. That, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing about them. They were taken, gathered as boys, from the Christian villages of the Balkans and Anatolia, from Greece, Serbia, Albania, Bulgaria, and beyond, through a system known as the Dev-Niame, a word that translates simply as collection. Ottoman officials would travel through the empire's conquered territories every few years, selecting the strongest, most promising boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 18, and folding them gently but irrevocably into the machinery of empire. Their families were compensated. Their former identities were not carried with them. They were converted to Islam. They were given new names, and they were trained, from the first years of adolescence, in the singular art of becoming an instrument of the Sultan's will. What followed was one of the ancient world's most rigorous military educations. The young recruits, called Asimi Oklanlar, or novice boys, spent years in preparatory schools before ever touching a weapon in anger. They studied Turkish language and Islamic theology. They were taught discipline through structured labor, physical endurance through relentless exercise, and loyalty through a form of psychological belonging that was, for many of them, the only family they would ever know. The Janissary Corps became their brotherhood, their identity, their entire world. Only after years of this preparation were they admitted into the full corps, and by then, they were something different from any soldier that had come before. They were professional warriors in an era when most armies were assembled seasonally from farmers who picked up swords between harvests. They were paid a regular salary, housed in dedicated barracks, and supplied by the state year-round. They ate well. They trained constantly, and they were forbidden, at least in the early centuries, from marrying, so that their devotion would have nowhere else to go. The Janissaries were perhaps the first true standing army of the medieval and early modern world. Their military feats are the kind that reshape maps. At the siege of Constantinople in 1453, it was the Janissaries who breached the ancient Theodosian walls that had held against armies and empires for over 1,000 years. When the Ottoman cannon fire opened a gap in the Great Stone, it was the Janissary Corps that poured through it, steady and relentless, while the rest of the Ottoman army watched. The city that had endured since the age of Constantine fell in a single morning, and history pivoted quietly on that moment. They were present at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, where the Hungarian kingdom was shattered in less than 2 hours. They anchored the lines at Chaldiran, Marj-Dabik, and Raidanieh. They carried the empire from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf. Wherever the Ottoman standard marched, the Janissaries walked beneath it, steady, professional, and almost always decisive. But what makes the Janissaries truly unforgettable, what separates their story from simple military history, is the arc of it. Because the same qualities that made them so formidable also made them, in time, ungovernable. Their devotion to the Sultan slowly, over centuries, curdled into political power of their own. They deposed emperors. They crowned new ones. They became, from the inside, the greatest threat to the very empire they had built. and in the end they were abolished in a single violent day, a day the Ottomans would call, with quiet understatement, the auspicious incident. This is their story, unhurried, complete. From the Balkan villages where boys were taken in the early light of morning, to the gleaming courts of Constantinople, to the dust of 100 battlefields, to the silence of barracks set ablaze by the order of the Sultan they had sworn to protect. Sit with it. There is no need to rush. The Janissaries waited centuries to be properly understood. Imagine a village in the foothills of the Balkans, somewhere in what is now Serbia, or Bulgaria, or the green rolling interior of Albania. The year might be 1450 or 1480 or 1510. It barely matters, because this scene repeated itself, with quiet regularity, for nearly 3 centuries. The morning is ordinary. Smoke rises from cook fires. Goats move along the hillside paths. Children are doing what children have always done in small places, wandering, playing, existing without the knowledge that the world beyond their hills has already made decisions about them. And then, along the road come the officials. They travel with scribes and with soldiers. They carry registers and imperial seals. They are not, in the way of armies, violent. They do not arrive with fire. They arrive with paperwork, with the quiet authority of a state so large and so confident in its power that it no longer needs to shout. The village elder is summoned. The priest, for these are Christian communities, many of them, is asked to produce the baptismal records. And then the process begins. The selection. The deviermi. Every boy in the village between roughly 8 and 18 years of age is brought forward to be assessed. The officials look for certain things. Height, yes, and physical strength, certainly, but also something less easily measured. Intelligence, bearing, the quality in a boy's eyes that suggests he might, under the right conditions, become something exceptional. The ideal candidate is described in Ottoman records with striking specificity. He should be tall, well-built, with a full face. He should not be the only son of his family, as some mercy was extended in that regard. He should not already be a tradesman's apprentice, because a boy already shaped by one discipline is harder to reshape into another. He should be, in the most fundamental sense, raw material. And raw material. The Ottoman state was extraordinarily skilled at transforming. The devierme, this systematic levy of Christian boys, is one of the most debated institutions in Ottoman history, and it deserves to be approached with the patience it requires, because it is easy, from a distance, to collapse it into simple categories. Easy to call it slavery, which in some legal and structural senses it was. Easy to call it an act of cultural erasure, which in some deep and irreversible ways it also was. But the full picture, as history almost always insists on being, is considerably more complicated than either of those framings alone can contain. The boys who were taken did not disappear into suffering. Many of them, a remarkable number in fact, rose to the highest offices the empire could offer. Grand viziers, admirals, governors of vast provinces, commanders of armies. Across the long history of the Ottoman Empire, an extraordinary proportion of its most powerful men had begun their lives as collected boys from Christian villages. The devierme was, in its strange and contradictory way, one of the most radical meritocracies the pre-modern world had ever produced. A boy from a Serbian peasant family could, if his abilities warranted it, hold more power than the princes of Europe, and many of them did. This does not erase the loss, but it complicates it, and complication here is the honest thing. For the families left behind, the moment of departure was etched into memory in ways that passed down through generations. Ottoman law, notably, forbade officials from taking boys by force if families genuinely resisted. though the social and political pressures of living under Ottoman rule made outright resistance a complicated proposition. In practice, many families complied. Some grieved deeply, some, aware of the possibilities the imperial system could offer a talented son, felt something closer to ambivalence. The aching arithmetic of a parent who knows that the road away from home may lead, for their child, somewhere better than the road that stays. There are accounts, particularly from Albanian communities, where families sometimes actively sought to have their sons included in the levy. Albania would, over the centuries, produce a remarkable number of Janissary commanders. Among them the legendary Gergely Castrioti, known to the world as Skanderbeg, who was himself taken through the Devurme, trained as an Ottoman officer, rose to command cavalry forces, and then, in one of history's great reversals, defected back to Albania and spent the rest of his life fighting the empire that had made him. He is remembered in Albania today as a national hero. The Ottomans, for their part, remembered him as a considerable problem. But Skanderbeg was the exception. Most boys, once taken, did not return. The process of transformation was too thorough, the new identity too complete, for the old one to survive intact. The journey from village to the imperial system began immediately and moved in stages. The selected boys were first gathered at a regional collection point, where they were formally registered, their Christian names recorded alongside their villages of origin, not out of sentiment, but because the Ottomans were meticulous administrators and liked to know where their human resources had come from. After registration, they were converted to Islam. This was not a violent or coercive ceremony in the immediate sense. There was no torture, no public spectacle of forced renunciation. It was, rather, an administrative fact. The Shahada was spoken, a new name was given, and the boy's relationship to his former self began, quietly, to dissolve. They were then assigned, in the first instance, not to military training but to labor on the farms and estates of Turkish families in Anatolia, a period called IEO clan service, which could last several years. This stage is often overlooked in popular tellings of Janissary history, but it was profoundly important. It was here that the boys learned Turkish fluently, not from a teacher in a classroom, but from the inside of daily life, from conversation and argument and laughter and the rhythm of agricultural work. They absorbed Ottoman customs, Ottoman food, Ottoman gestures and prayers and ways of understanding the world. By the time they were transferred to the palace schools and barracks for formal training, they were no longer Serbian or Bulgarian or Albanian boys who had been relocated. They were, in most of the ways that mattered practically, Ottoman. The old self had not been destroyed through cruelty. It had been gradually, patiently replaced. For those selected for the most elite trajectory, the palace schools of Constantinople, particularly the Topkapi school, known as the Enderun. The education that awaited was remarkable by any standard of the era. The Enderun was not a military academy in the narrow sense. It was something closer to what we might today call a comprehensive institution of human excellence. Boys studied the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence alongside mathematics, poetry, history, and music. They were trained in horsemanship, archery, wrestling, and the use of the sword. They were taught the protocols of the imperial court, how to move within it, how to speak within it, when to be visible, and when to disappear. Discipline was enforced, but the atmosphere that Ottoman chroniclers describe is one of structured purpose rather than misery. The boys slept in dormitories. They ate communally. They competed against one another in athletic contests that were both genuine sport and continuous evaluation. The teachers, themselves often former Devurme boys who had risen through the system, understood that they were not merely educating students. They were selecting the next generation of Ottoman leadership. Every examination, every athletic contest, every demonstration of character under pressure was, in its way, an audition. The most capable graduates of the Enderun did not become Janissaries at all. They became palace officials, administrators, cavalry officers of the Sipahi Corps, or members of the inner household of the Sultan himself. The Janissary Corps, for all its legendary prestige, represented only one possible destination for the Defwemi boys. It was the largest destination and the most famous, but the Ottoman system was broader than any single institution within it. For the boys who did enter the Janissary Corps specifically, the path led to the Assami Oklanlar, the novice battalions. Here, the military education proper began, and it was serious. The Assami Oklanlar were housed in dedicated barracks, fed from communal kitchens, and subjected to a regimen of physical training that began before sunrise and filled the long hours of daylight with drills, exercises, weapon practice, and the particular discipline of learning to move in formation, not as individuals, as a single body. This was the central lesson of early Janissary training, and it was not merely tactical, it was psychological. The Ottoman military mind had understood something that many contemporary armies had not yet grasped. That individual bravery, on its own, is an unreliable thing. It surges and collapses with mood and fear and fortune. But collective discipline, the ability of men to hold their position not because they are individually unafraid, but because they are bound to the men beside them by something stronger than fear, that is a reliable thing. That can be trained into a person. That can be made into a habit as automatic as breathing. The novices learned this through repetition, marching in step until it required no thought, forming lines under pressure until disorder became physically uncomfortable, responding to drum signals. Because the Janissaries famously used military music, the metaband, to communicate on the battlefield, until the sound of a particular rhythm produced an immediate conditioned response. Modern military historians have noted that the Janissary approach to battlefield communication through music predates similar European practices by generations. By the time a young man completed the Assami Oklanlar and was formally admitted into the Janissary Corps, a moment marked by ceremony, by the receiving of his white felt cap, the kika, and by induction into one of the Corps' numbered ortas, or companies. He was not the same person who had stood in a Balkan village years before, blinking at imperial officials. He was shaped, finished, belonging completely to something larger than himself, and this belonging was not merely institutional. The Janissaries ate together from a shared cauldron, the kazan, which was not simply a cooking vessel but a symbol of such deep significance that it would later become a political weapon. To overturn the cauldron was, in Janissary tradition, to declare revolt. To be deprived of the right to eat from it was the Corps' most devastating punishment. The shared meal was the foundation of identity. Every man in a company knew that his worth was expressed by his place at that pot. This is not a small thing. Across all of human history, the shared table has been the basic unit of belonging. The Ottomans understood this instinctively, and they built an entire military culture around it. The boys became men, the men became soldiers, and the soldiers, over the long decades of the empire's expansion, became something that the world had not quite seen before, and would not quite see again in quite that form. They had been gathered from the edges of the empire, from villages that would not remember their names for long. They had been remade, quietly and methodically, into the most formidable infantry force of their age. And the campaign season was beginning. There is a question worth sitting with before we go further. What does it actually take to make a man into something extraordinary? Not merely a competent soldier. History has always had those in abundance. But a warrior so disciplined, so psychologically fortified, so bound to his purpose that he functions with precision under conditions that reduce ordinary men to confusion and fear. Armies throughout history have asked this question and arrived at different answers. The Spartans answered it with isolation and brutality, beginning almost at birth. The Roman legions answered it with relentless drilling and the promise of land and citizenship. The Mongols answered it with a lifetime of horsemanship and hunger and the open steppe. The Ottomans answered it with something subtler and, in many ways, more durable. They answered it with belonging. By the time a young man entered the Janissary Corps proper, having passed through the Dev Fueme selection, the years of Anatolian labor, the novice battalions, and the long patient accumulation of Ottoman identity, he arrived not as a recruit looking for direction, but as a person who had already, in some deep and settled sense, found it. The Corps did not need to convince him of his purpose. Years of careful preparation had already done that work. What the Corps provided, from the moment of formal induction, was something every human being requires in order to truly flourish: a place. A definite, named, honored place within a community of people who understood precisely what you were and valued it. He was assigned to an autor, one of the Janissary companies, which at the Corps' height numbered into the hundreds. Each autor had its own number, its own commanding officer, its own dormitory, its own section of the great communal kitchen, and its own esprit de corps, accumulated over decades of shared service. To be transferred between authors was considered a disruption significant enough to require careful handling. Men did not simply belong to the Janissary Corps in the abstract. They belonged to their specific company, their specific brotherhood, with a loyalty that was almost familial in its texture. And this texture was not accidental. It was engineered with the same deliberate intelligence that shaped every other aspect of the Janissary system. The barracks themselves, the kingula, were not merely housing. They were the physical architecture of a way of life, designed to keep the men together. The barracks arranged dormitories, kitchens, training grounds, and places of worship into a single self-contained world. A Janissary in his prime years spent almost his entire daily existence within or immediately around this complex. He worked there, prayed there, trained there, ate there, slept there, and argued and laughed and grieved there alongside the same men year after year. The outside world, the markets of Constantinople, the neighborhoods of ordinary city life, was accessible, but it was peripheral. The barracks was the center of gravity. Early in the Corps' history, marriage was forbidden entirely. This rule would erode over the centuries, but in the period of the Janissaries' greatest military effectiveness, roughly the 14th through the mid-16th century, the prohibition held. It was not enforced through cruelty, but through a frank institutional logic. A man with a wife and children at home has his attention divided. He has something to survive for that exists outside the Corps and outside the Sultan's service. The Janissaries were not meant to have that division. Their survival instinct, insofar as it could be shaped and redirected, was meant to flow not toward private futures, but toward the collective preservation of the brotherhood. The effect, over time, was exactly what the Ottoman architects of the system had intended. The men became each other's family in the fullest practical sense. The company was where grief was witnessed and absorbed. It was where illness was tended, where a young soldier's failures were corrected and his successes acknowledged. The commanding officers of each order, the sorbaka, a word that means, with a wonderful specificity, soup man, a reference to his responsibility for feeding the company, functioned as much as paternal figures as military commanders. Discipline ran through the Corps, not primarily as punishment, but as expectation, the way discipline runs through any tightly knit community that values its own reputation. The training itself was relentless, but it is worth being precise about what relentless meant in this context. It did not mean chaos. It did not mean the kind of brutalizing randomness that some military traditions have used to break men down before building them up again. Janissary training was structured, sequential, patient. It understood that human beings develop skills through repetition across time, not through intensity across a single terrible morning. Archery was among the first and most sustained disciplines. The Ottoman composite bow, a layered construction of wood, horn, and sinew that took months to produce and years to master, was capable of launching an arrow with accuracy at distances that astonished European observers. Janissary archers practiced daily, through every season, in all weather conditions. There are records of archery ranges maintained near the barracks specifically for this purpose, and of competitions held regularly between companies to keep the standard high and the motivation sharp. A Janissary who could not draw his bow reliably at distance was not yet a Janissary in any complete sense. He was still becoming one. Alongside archery came close-quarters weapons training: the sword, the spear, the short curved blade, wrestling, both as physical conditioning and as a practical skill for the press of infantry combat. Later, as the Ottoman military modernized, the integration of firearms, the arquebus, and eventually the musket, became central to Janissary identity in ways that set them apart dramatically from almost every other contemporary infantry force. Most armies of the 15th and 16th centuries treated firearms as supplementary, as something to be used at the edges of a battle, and then set aside in favor of the decisive cavalry charge. The Janissaries embraced them as primary weapons, trained with them obsessively, and developed collective firing tactics: volley fire, sequential reloading. That would not become standard practice in European armies for another century. This was not accident. This was an institution capable of identifying the future and training toward it while everyone else was still learning the present. And then there was the faith. To understand the Janissaries fully, it is necessary to understand the particular Islamic tradition they adopted, not the mainstream Sunni practice of the Ottoman court and clergy, though they observed that too, but the devotional culture of the Bektashi Sufi order, which became so deeply entwined with the Janissary core that the two were, for most of their shared history, effectively inseparable. The Bektashi order was a mystical branch of Islam, characterized by a warmth and inclusivity that distinguished it from more rigorous Orthodox traditions. It was syncretic, meaning it absorbed and incorporated elements from the various religious cultures around it, including Christianity and pre-Islamic Anatolian belief. This made it, perhaps, a natural spiritual home for men who had themselves begun their lives in Christian households and been brought into Islam through the Devyome. The Bektashi tradition did not demand the erasure of everything that came before. It made space for complexity. The Bektashi spiritual guides, the Babas, were present in the Janissary barracks as chaplains, counselors, and figures of moral authority. They conducted the rituals of the order, led communal prayer and meditation, and provided the kind of existential grounding that men facing the prospect of violent death have always sought and always needed. The relationship between the core and the order was formalized in legend by the great Sufi Saint Hasi Bektar Veli, who was said to have blessed the first Janissaries personally in the 14th century, placing his wide sleeve over the head of the first soldier in a gesture that gave the Janissaries' distinctive white felt cap, the keki, its legendary spiritual origin. Whether the story is literally true matters less than what it meant to the men who carried it. A soldier who believes that his uniform was blessed by a saint fights differently from one who does not. He fights with a settled interior quality, not recklessness, which is the courage of a man who does not value his life, but composure, which is the courage of a man who has made peace with what his life is for. This composure, this quality of settled, purposeful calm, is what foreign observers noted most consistently when they encountered the Janissaries in person. European ambassadors and military men who visited Constantinople in the 15th and 16th centuries returned home with accounts that share a recurring quality of surprised admiration. The discipline they described was not the tense, rigid discipline of men barely keeping fear in check. It was something more settled than that. the Janissaries in their barracks, in their training grounds, on the march. They moved, one Venetian observer wrote in the late 1400s, as though they had done this particular thing 1,000 times before, and expected to do it 1,000 times more. That quality does not come from drilling alone. It comes from the complete integration of physical training, psychological belonging, and spiritual meaning into a single coherent life. When a man knows who he is, knows his place, knows what is asked of him, and believes that what is asked of him has significance beyond mere survival, he becomes, in the most profound sense, ready. The Janissaries were ready in this way, consistently, professionally, over generations. There is one final aspect of the Janissary experience that deserves attention before we move to the campaigns that made them legendary, and it is the one most often overlooked in accounts that focus on military mechanics. They were proud. This seems obvious, perhaps even trivial. Of course, elite soldiers are proud, but the nature of Janissary pride was specific and worth examining. It was not the pride of inherited status, of men who had been born into martial aristocracy and trained since childhood in the certainty of their own superiority. These were men who had been, by the standards of their birth, nobody, peasant boys from the margins of empire. They had been taken, remade, tested, and found worthy, not by the accident of birth, but by the demonstration of ability. And the system they inhabited continually reminded them of this. Promotion within the corps was based on seniority and demonstrated competence. The cauldron fed everyone equally. The kekase was worn by every man regardless of his origins. This produced a pride that was, paradoxically, both individual and collective. Each man took personal satisfaction in his membership of something excellent, and each man understood that the excellence belonged to all of them together, and that his own contribution to it was both necessary and valued. They trained, they prayed, they ate from the shared pot, they sharpened their weapons and their bodies and their minds. And when the Sultan's campaign season came, when the great Ottoman war machine began its slow, magnificent assembly outside the walls of Constantinople, the Janissaries were always at its core, steady, complete, ready for whatever lay beyond the horizon. The horizon, in the century that followed, held a great deal. An empire does not grow by wishing. It grows by movement, by the long, grinding, logistically staggering process of moving armies across mountain passes and river crossings and open plains, of feeding thousands of men and tens of thousands of horses across distances that would seem impractical to anyone who had not already done it. It grows through sieges that last months and battles that are decided in hours. It grows through the accumulation of decisive moments, each one hinging on the question of which force, when the pressure became unbearable, held its shape longest. For the Ottoman Empire, across nearly 2 centuries of its most extraordinary expansion, that question had a consistent answer. The Janissaries held. And because they held, empires fell. To trace the campaigns of the Janissary Corps is to trace the arc of the Ottoman world at its most dynamic and most dangerous. It is to follow a force that was present at some of the most consequential military events in human history. Events that did not merely redraw borders but reordered civilizations, ended dynasties that had endured for centuries, and opened the door to a new political reality that the modern world is still, in some ways, living inside. We begin where history most insistently begins when the Janissaries are mentioned. We begin at Constantinople. In the spring of 1453, the city had been the crown of the Christian world for over 1,000 years, built by Constantine the Great in 330 CE, on a peninsula commanding the Bosphorus Strait, where Europe and Asia breathe against each other across a narrow ribbon of water. Constantinople was not merely a capital, it was a concept. The idea that Christian civilization had a center, a beating heart, a place where the weight of Rome's legacy had been preserved through the fall of everything else. Its walls, the great Theodosian land walls, built in the 5th century and reinforced and expanded and repaired across the following millennium, had repelled Avars and Arabs, Bulgarians and Crusaders, and a dozen other forces that had arrived with the intention of taking what lay behind them. The walls had never fallen to an external assault, not once, in 1,000 years. The young Sultan who arrived before them in April of 1453 was 21 years old. Mehmed II, who had earned the epithet Fatih, the Conqueror, before the season was out, brought with him an army estimated at between 80,000 and 100,000 men, the largest military force the region had seen in generations. He brought enormous cannon, engineered by a Hungarian master named Urban, capable of hurling stone balls of 600 kilograms against walls that had been built in an age before gunpowder was a meaningful consideration. He brought a navy to seal the sea approaches. He brought patience, which is the most important thing any commander can bring to a siege. And he brought the Janissaries, perhaps 12,000 of them, forming the disciplined, professional core around which the rest of the vast Ottoman army was organized. The siege lasted 53 days. During those 7.5 weeks, the Ottoman cannon worked steadily against sections of the outer wall, reducing stonework that had stood for centuries to rubble and dust. The Byzantine defenders, numbering perhaps 7,000 in total, including Venetian and Genoese volunteers fighting alongside the Greek garrison, repaired the breaches at night with wood and earth, buying themselves another day with every dawn. They were brave in the way that men facing overwhelming odds sometimes become, completely, quietly, heartbreakingly brave. But they were also running out of everything: men, supplies, time. On the night of the 28th of May, the final Ottoman assault was planned. Mehmed committed his forces in waves, the irregulars first, the Anatolian infantry second, and finally, when the defenders had been worn and bloodied and pushed to the edge of collapse, the Janissaries. The accounts of what happened in those final hours vary in their specifics, as eyewitness accounts of chaotic events always do. But they agree on the essential shape of it. The Janissaries advanced in the pre-dawn darkness in ordered formation, without the screaming and disorder that had characterized the earlier waves. They moved, observers noted, in silence, or as close to silence as 12,000 armed men can achieve. The metaband played behind them, its deep drums and resonant horns setting a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, that communicated to every man in the formation that what they were doing was deliberate, controlled, already decided. They found a breach, a section of the inner wall near the Blachini quarter, where the stonework had been compromised, and a small gate. The Kerko Porta, legend says, left inadvertently unlocked in the confusion of the night, offered entry. The Janissaries poured through. The Byzantine line, stretched beyond recovery and already engaged along its entire length, could not seal the gap. The last emperor of Rome, Constantine VI Palaiologos, reportedly threw off his imperial regalia and charged into the fighting on foot, and was not seen again. By mid-morning, Constantinople had fallen. Mehmed rode into the city that afternoon and made immediately for the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, where he ordered that the call to prayer be made from its galleries. The building that had been the greatest church in the Christian world for nearly 1,000 years became, before the day was over, a mosque. The transformation was not merely architectural. An age had ended, and the Janissaries had ended it. The fall of Constantinople was the most dramatic of the Janissary Corps' achievements, but it was far from the last. The following century would see the Ottoman Empire expand in every direction simultaneously, east, west, south, and the Janissaries would be at the center of each expansion, the reliable steel core of an army that was, in this period, without peer. in the known world. In 1514, Selim I, the Sultan, who would earn his own epithet, Yavuz, the Grim, and deserve it thoroughly, led the Ottoman army east to confront the Safavid Persian Empire under Shah Ismail. The two powers had been circling each other with increasing hostility, and the dispute had both political and religious dimensions. The Ottomans were Sunni, the Safavids Shia, and the theological animosity between them was real and sharp. But what brought them to the plain of Chaldiran in August of 1514 was ultimately territorial ambition and the particular combativeness of two expanding powers whose borders had run out of space between them. The Battle of Chaldiran is worth examining carefully because it illustrates something important about how the Janissaries won battles and how they changed the nature of warfare in the process. Shah Ismail commanded a force of Qizilbash cavalry, light and ferocious, and deeply motivated by religious fervor. They were exceptional horsemen, accustomed to the fast, fluid, mobile style of warfare that the steppe and the Persian highlands had produced over centuries. Against many opponents, this style was devastatingly effective. Against the Janissaries, it met something it had not encountered before and could not overcome. The Janissaries deployed in a formation the Ottomans called the Tabur Sengi, the wagon fort, a defensive structure of chained wagons and artillery behind which the Janissary musketeers and arquebusiers arranged themselves in sequential firing lines. When the Qizilbash cavalry charged, they charged into a wall of disciplined, continuous gunfire, unlike anything they had faced. The volleys were not ragged or panicked. They were coordinated, each rank firing and stepping back to reload, while the next rank stepped forward. The sound of it, witnesses recorded, was less like individual shots and more like a sustained, rolling thunder that did not stop. The Safavid cavalry broke. Ismail himself was wounded. The Ottoman army rolled forward. The Safavid capital of Tabriz fell within weeks, and though the Ottomans could not hold it permanently, the strategic message of Chaldiran was unmistakable. The age of cavalry dominance in open field warfare was ending, and the force that had ended it was already equipped and trained for what came next. Selim. I did not pause for long. The following year, 1506, he turned south. The Mamluk Sultanate, a formidable power that controlled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, had been watching the Ottoman expansion with growing unease, and had made the diplomatic error of aligning too closely with the Safavids for Selim's comfort. It was, in the end, a fatal miscalculation. The two forces met at the Battle of Majd-Dabik on a plain north of Aleppo in August of 1516. The Mamluks were, by any historical measure, extraordinary warriors. Their cavalry tradition was ancient and refined. Generations of military slaves turned rulers, trained from childhood in the arts of horsemanship and combat, had produced a fighting force that had, a century and a half earlier, broken the Mongol advance at the Battle of Ain Jalut. They were not to be underestimated. But Majd-Dabik was Chaldiran again, in its essential logic. The Mamluk cavalry could not close the distance to the Janissary lines through the sustained, organized firepower that greeted their charge. The Mamluk Sultan, Kansu al-Ghari, died in the battle, of a stroke, the accounts suggest, possibly triggered by the catastrophic collapse of his army around him. The Mamluk force disintegrated. Syria fell to the Ottomans within months. Selim pressed on south. In early 1517, at the Battle of Raidanieh outside Cairo, the remaining Mamluk forces under the new Sultan Tumen Beythu made their final stand. They had repositioned their own artillery in the hope of replicating the Ottoman tactic against its originators, a bold adaptation that showed genuine military intelligence. But the Janissaries, experienced now in exactly this kind of positional warfare, flanked the Mamluk gun line and rendered it irrelevant. Cairo fell. Egypt fell. The last Abbasid Caliph in Cairo transferred his religious authority to Selim, and the Ottoman Sultan became, in that moment, the Caliph of Sunni Islam. In the space of 2 years, Selim had doubled the size of the Ottoman Empire. The Janissaries had been at the center of every decisive engagement. The campaigns of Suleiman I Kanuni, the lawgiver, known to Europe as Suleiman the Magnificent, carried the core to its widest geographic reach and its most storied confrontations. Suleiman ruled from 1520 to 1566, a reign of nearly half a century that represented the Ottoman Empire at the absolute apex of its power, competence, and administrative sophistication. He was a man of genuine intellectual and aesthetic cultivation as well as military ambition, and he understood the Janissaries not merely as a weapon but as an institution, one that required careful management and reciprocal respect. In 1521, Suleiman took Belgrade, the fortress city that had twice repelled his great-grandfather Murad II, and had stood as a symbol of the boundary between Ottoman reach and European resistance. The city fell after a methodical siege in which Janissary engineering, the corps had by this period developed significant expertise in siege warfare, in the digging of approach trenches and the placement of mines beneath fortification walls, was as important as its fighting quality. 5 years later, in 1526, came Mohacs. The Kingdom of Hungary, which had been a significant European power and a persistent thorn in Ottoman expansion, met the Ottoman army on the plains of southern Hungary on the 29th of August. The battle lasted, by most estimates, less than 2 hours. King Louis II of Hungary led an army of around 20 to 25,000 men, knights, mercenaries and infantry, against an Ottoman force perhaps 3 times that size, anchored by the Janissary Corps and supported by Ottoman artillery that had been positioned with the careful deliberation of an army that had done this many times before. The Hungarian cavalry charge, brave and, in the tradition of European medieval warfare, dramatic, broke against the Janissary lines and the Ottoman guns in almost exactly the same way that the Qizilbash and Mamluk cavalry had broken a decade earlier. The Janissaries absorbed the charge, held, and then the Ottoman flanks closed. The Hungarian army ceased, effectively, to exist as a fighting force within the morning. King Louis died in the retreat, thrown from his horse into a marsh. The Kingdom of Hungary, which had been a political reality for 5 centuries, fragmented into vassalage and partition. Suleiman's chronicler recorded the Sultan walking the battlefield afterward in silence, and the sources agree on this detail, expressing something that looked like sorrow at the scale of the destruction. Whether this was genuine sentiment or political theater is impossible to know. What is certain is that the Janissaries had, in under 2 hours, effectively ended a kingdom. The following year, 1527, the Ottoman army pushed into Austria, reaching the walls of Vienna in September of 1529. The siege of Vienna would become, in retrospect, one of history's most argued over near misses as, the moment at which Ottoman expansion into the European heartland reached its high watermark and receded. The siege ultimately failed, not because of any decisive defeat in the field, but because of time and weather. The campaign had started late in the season. The great Ottoman siege artillery, too heavy for the rain-soaked Balkan roads, had been left behind. Vienna's walls, though not as formidable as Constantinople's had been, were sufficient when the Janissaries lacked the artillery support that had made previous sieges possible. The Ottomans withdrew in good order, which itself speaks to the professionalism of the corps. Armies that have failed in an objective frequently become dangerous to themselves on the retreat. Discipline collapses, foraging becomes looting, the structure of command phrase. The Ottoman withdrawal from Vienna was orderly. The Janissaries marched out the way they had marched in formation, under command, with their standards. They would return, decades later. And decades after that, other Ottoman armies would come back again. Vienna would haunt Ottoman strategic ambition for another century and a half. But it is worth pausing here to consider what had been accomplished in the space of roughly 100 years, from the fall of Constantinople to the high tide of Suleiman's campaigns. The Ottoman Empire, with the Janissary corps at its military core, had absorbed the Byzantine Empire, the Mamluk Sultanate, most of the former territories of the Timurid states, Hungary, large portions of North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula, including the holy cities. It controlled the major trade routes between Europe and Asia. It was, by almost any measure of the 16th century, the most powerful state on earth. And at the center of that power, steady and professional and psychologically complete in the way that the best military institutions always produce in their finest periods, stood the men of the orders, the soup pot soldiers, the boys who had been taken from Balkan villages and remade into something the world had not seen before. They had built an empire with their feet and their firearms and their extraordinary practiced calm. What they had not yet reckoned with was what happens to an elite institution when the empire it serves runs out of new worlds to conquer, when the energy of expansion turns inward and the most powerful force in the state begins to ask not what it can do for the Sultan, but what the Sultan can do for it. That question, patient as siege warfare, was already beginning to form. Power, left long enough in one place, changes its shape. This is not a moral observation. It is simply a description of how institutions behave across time, how the qualities that make them great in one era become, in another, the very source of their danger. The Roman Praetorian Guard began as the emperor's most trusted protectors, and became, within 2 centuries, the mechanism by which emperors were made and unmade at the whim of soldiers. The Mamluks, those same formidable warriors whose cavalry had broken at Majdabik against Janissary gunfire, had themselves begun as military slaves serving the Ayyubid Sultanate before they overthrew their masters entirely and ruled Egypt for 2.5 centuries in their own name. The Janissaries would follow a version of this arc. Not quickly. Nothing about the Janissary story moves quickly, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of an institution that has grown too powerful to be ignored, too cohesive to be frightened, and too aware of its own indispensability to remain purely obedient. The transformation did not happen on a single day. It happened across generations, through the accumulation of small precedents, each one individually manageable, collectively irreversible. The first serious tremor came earlier than most histories emphasize, in 1449, before the conquest of Constantinople, before the great campaigns that would define Janissary legend. There was already an episode that revealed something important about the relationship between the core and the throne. Murad II, father of Mehmed the Conqueror, faced a Janissary demand for increased pay following a military campaign. The demand was not made through petition. It was made through the overturning of the soup cauldrons, that potent symbol of collective Janissary identity, which was the core's established signal of organized protest, sitting just at the edge of outright revolt. Murad paid. This was the rational choice for a ruler facing an imminent military challenge who needed his elite infantry cooperative and battle-ready. It was also, in retrospect, the first lesson the Janissaries learned about what leverage felt like. A lesson, once learned, that is very difficult to unlearn. The conditions that allowed this leverage to grow were structural, and they deepened as the 16th century progressed. The most significant was the gradual erosion of the Devwami system itself, the very process that had created the core in its original form. The Devi army had worked in its finest period because it produced men who had no political constituency outside the core itself. They had no family land to protect, no inherited title to defend, no tribal allegiance that predated their Ottoman identity. They were, in the most complete sense, the Sultan's men. Their loyalty was unencumbered by competing obligations. This was, of course, by design. The Ottoman architects of the system had understood perfectly well that an elite force composed of men with outside loyalties is an elite force that cannot be fully trusted. But over the course of the 16th century, the sons of serving Janissaries began to be admitted into the corps, at first as an exception, then as a growing practice, then, gradually, as something close to a norm. The reasons were practical. The administrative demands of running the denier system were considerable, and as the corps expanded in size, the simpler solution of allowing hereditary membership became increasingly attractive to the officials responsible for maintaining the roles. The consequences, however, were profound. A Janissary who had been born to a Janissary father had precisely the kinds of outside loyalties and local roots that the original system had been designed to exclude. He had family in the neighborhood. He had property interests, commercial relationships, a community identity that existed independently of the corps. He was, in the most fundamental sense, a different kind of soldier from the denier boy who had arrived with nothing and been given everything by the institution. As the proportion of hereditary members grew, the character of the corps changed with it. The Janissaries became less a professional military brotherhood and more a hereditary guild, an organization that existed partly to protect the interests of its members, including interests that had nothing to do with military service. Commerce entered the barracks, and with it came a softening of the old discipline that contemporaries noted with increasing alarm. Janissaries in the major cities, Constantinople above all, began to engage openly in trades and businesses. They ran shops. They operated in the markets. They used their institutional status and the implicit threat of collective Janissary displeasure as a kind of commercial protection that made them formidable economic actors as well as military ones. To have a dispute with a Janissary merchant was not simply a commercial disagreement. It was a potential confrontation with an armed brotherhood that had demonstrated repeatedly its willingness to use organized force to protect its interests. The city population of Constantinople developed a complicated relationship with the corps as a result. The Janissaries were simultaneously resented and relied upon, feared as a source of disorder and, paradoxically, depended upon as a kind of informal neighborhood authority that provided a rough species of local order. They occupied a space that blurred the distinction between protector and predator in ways that made them difficult to govern and impossible to ignore. The sultans watched this evolution with a mixture of frustration and caution, because the fundamental problem of managing the Janissaries was always the same. They were still, for all their political complications, the best military force available, and in a state that faced real external threats. From Safavid Persia in the east, from the Habsburg Empire in the west, from the Venetians and the Poles and the Russians at various points along the vast Ottoman perimeter. The luxury of dismantling your best army because it had become inconveniently powerful was a luxury few sultans felt they could afford. So they managed. They negotiated. They paid the increases the corps demanded. And with each payment, with each concession, the implicit understanding settled more deeply into the institutional relationship. The Sultan needed the Janissaries more than the Janissaries needed any particular sultan. The political consequences of this understanding were dramatic and, at times, bloody. Between the late 16th century and the early 19th, the Janissaries deposed or played decisive roles in removing at least 6 Ottoman sultans. This is not a minor footnote. This is the Praetorian pattern made real. The transformation of an elite military corps into the effective arbiters of imperial succession. Osman II, who came to the throne in 1608 at the age of 14 and proved to be a young man of genuine intelligence and reforming ambition, understood the problem clearly and attempted to address it directly. He saw the Janissary corps for what it had become: bloated, commercially compromised, politically dangerous and militarily mediocre compared to its historical peak, and he began to develop plans for its systematic replacement with a new army drawn from the Turkish and Anatolian population of Anatolia, a force that would owe him personal loyalty in the way the original Devyermi boys had owed loyalty to the institution. The Janissaries found out. In 1622, they rose. Osman II was seized, deposed, and killed, strangled in the fortress of Yedikule by men from the very corps he had sought to replace. He was 17 years old. His murder was an act of such brazen institutional self-protection that it shocked even observers who were already accustomed to Ottoman court violence. The Janissaries had not merely deposed a sultan. They had killed one for the specific crime of trying to limit their power. The message was received. For the next 2 centuries, no sultan would attempt the same thing directly. What replaced direct confrontation was a long, exhausting dance of accommodation and indirect pressure. Sultans working around the Janissaries rather than against them, attempting to build alternative military structures that could gradually reduce the corps' indispensability without triggering the violent response that direct challenge had always produced. The results were mixed. The progress slow and frequently reversed, and the Ottoman military capacity suffered throughout. Meanwhile, the world outside was not standing still. The European powers that the Janissaries had once outmatched technologically and tactically were, through the 17th and 18th centuries, developing military systems of increasing sophistication. The military revolution that historians have traced through early modern Europe, the professionalization of armies, the development of linear tactics, the systematic integration of combined arms, was producing forces that the Janissaries, frozen by institutional conservatism into the tactics of their 16th century peak, could no longer reliably defeat in open battle. The Janissaries resisted military modernization with the full force of their political power. When reforming sultans attempted to introduce new drilling methods, European-style training regiments, or updated tactical formations, the corps obstructed, protested, and occasionally revolted. Their objection was not purely self-interested. There was a genuine element of institutional pride, a belief that the Janissary way was the correct way, and that foreign methods represented an insult to a tradition that had conquered half the known world. But the practical effect of this resistance was that the Ottoman army fell steadily further behind European military development at precisely the period when European military power was expanding most rapidly. The defeats accumulated. Not catastrophically at first, the Ottomans won battles and campaigns throughout the 17th century, and the empire remained vast and formidable. But the trajectory was visible to those willing to look at it honestly. The Second Siege of Vienna, in 1683, ended in a rout. The Ottoman army broken and pursued across Hungary by a coalition force led by the Polish king Jan III Sobieski. It was the most decisive Ottoman military defeat in 2.5 centuries, and the beginning of a long territorial retreat that would not stop for 200 years. By the early 19th century, the Janissary Corps had become something its founders would not have recognized. Its rolls, which had once numbered around 12,000 in the Corps' classic period, had swollen to figures that various Ottoman records put it anywhere between 100 and 400,000, the majority of whom were phantom soldiers, names on pay registers attached to men who had never trained, never served, and in some cases never existed. The funds allocated to maintaining them flowed instead into the pockets of the officers who managed the accounts. The men who did serve were, with individual exceptions, a pale shadow of the institution's historic standard. The fierce collective identity of the orta, the daily drilling, the Bektashi devotional discipline, the shared cauldron as a living symbol of brotherhood. These things still existed in form. In substance, they had been hollowed out by 2 centuries of commercial distraction, hereditary dilution, and the corrosive effect of an institution that had spent too long protecting its privileges to remember what those privileges had originally been granted for. The Ottoman state was, by this point, genuinely afraid of its own army, not in the way that a state is afraid of a powerful weapon it must handle carefully, in the way that a household is afraid of something dangerous that has moved in and cannot be asked to leave. A new sultan was coming who would not be afraid, who had watched and learned and waited, who had spent years building, quietly and in secret, the instrument that would finally answer the question that Osman II had asked with his life 200 years earlier. What happens when you decide that the cost of keeping the Janissaries is finally greater than the cost of removing them? Segment 5. The auspicious incident, the end of an immortal core. Mahmud II had been watching for a long time. He had come to the throne in 1808 under conditions that illustrated with brutal clarity exactly what the Janissary problem had become. His predecessor, Mustafa IV, had been deposed by a reforming faction. Before that, Selim III, a sultan of genuine vision who had attempted to build a modern European-style infantry force alongside the Janissaries, a unit called the Nizam Sedid, the New Order, had been overthrown and eventually murdered when the Janissaries identified his reforms as an existential threat to their institutional primacy. The pattern was by now well established. Sultans who reached for change were destroyed by the force they most needed to change. Sultans who did not reach for change presided over an empire that continued its long deterioration. Mahmud had watched all of this. He had survived a palace environment that killed rulers with some regularity, and survival in such an environment requires a particular quality of mind: patient, observant, capable of long concealment. He was not a timid man, but he was a careful one, and he understood something that Osman II, 2 centuries earlier, had not understood when he moved too quickly and paid with his life, that the Janissary core could not be confronted until the confrontation was certain to succeed. One failed attempt would end him. There would be no second chance. So he waited, and while he waited, he prepared. The preparation was meticulous and conducted with the discretion that the situation demanded. Throughout the late 1810s and into the early 1820s, Mahmud worked steadily to build the conditions that would make eventual action possible. He cultivated the religious establishment, the ulema, whose authority gave any Ottoman political act its ideological legitimacy. He worked carefully within the military to identify and elevate officers who were either loyal to him personally or sympathetic to reform. He maintained outwardly a posture of accommodation toward the Janissaries, giving them little reason to perceive him as an immediate threat. Meanwhile, the empire's military weakness was making the argument for reform more powerful with every passing year. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821, exposed the Janissary corps as not merely corrupt and politically dangerous, but operationally useless, in ways that could no longer be explained away. When deployed against the Greek insurgency, the Janissaries performed with a combination of incompetence and brutality that achieved neither military effectiveness nor political stability. They could not suppress a rebellion. They could not hold territory. They could not adapt to the kind of irregular, mobile warfare that the Greek fighters employed with considerable skill in the mountains and peninsulas of their homeland. The reports that came back to Constantinople were damning, and Mahmud, who had been building his case for years, found that the case was now building itself. By 1826, he was ready. The mechanism he chose was elegant in its use of existing precedent. He announced the creation of a new infantry force, the Akinci Corps, to be trained along European lines and embedded within the existing military structure alongside the Janissaries. The announcement was carefully worded. This was not a replacement. This was a supplement. There was no direct confrontation, no declaration that the Janissaries were inadequate. There was simply a new unit, responding to new military realities that would serve the empire alongside the existing core. The Janissaries were not deceived. They had been here before, had seen Selim III's Nizam Saidid, and understood correctly what it represented. A parallel force, once established, would grow. It would receive resources and royal favor. It would eventually make the old core redundant, and redundant institutions do not survive in the proximity of power. On the 14th of June, 1826, the cauldrons were overturned. The Janissaries rose in revolt, massing at the Ed Maidan, the great square in Constantinople, where the core had traditionally gathered in times of collective action. The overturning of the cauldrons was their ancient signal, their declaration that the Brotherhood was in motion, and the Sultan had better pay attention. What they did not know, what Mahmud had spent years ensuring they would not know until it was too late, was that this time, the Sultan had already answered the question before they asked it. Mahmud moved with a speed and decisiveness that stands in complete contrast to the long patience of his preparation. Almost immediately after the Janissary assembly began to coalesce at the Et Maidan, the Sultan summoned the Sankag for Irif, the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad, kept in the Topkapı palace and unfurled only in moments of supreme Ottoman emergency. Its appearance was both a religious summons and a political declaration. Anyone who opposed the Sultan now opposed not merely the imperial authority, but the banner under which the Prophet's community had always gathered. The religious establishment, whose careful cultivation by Mahmud now bore its full fruit, issued a fatwa, a formal Islamic legal ruling, declaring the Janissary revolt to be a rebellion against legitimate authority, and permitting the use of lethal force to suppress it. This was not a bureaucratic formality. In the Ottoman political context, a fatwa from the Ahlul Islam carried genuine ideological weight. It transformed what might have been perceived as a sultan attacking his own army into a legitimate Islamic authority, suppressing an unlawful uprising. The framing mattered enormously, and Mahmud had secured it before a single shot was fired. Loyal troops, artillery units and cavalry forces that Mahmud had spent years quietly cultivating surrounded the Et Maidan. The Janissaries gathered within it were, in the most literal sense, enclosed. And then the artillery opened fire. The barracks were bombarded directly. The ancient buildings, those same barracks that had housed the core for centuries, where the cauldrons had been tended and the prayers had been said and the young men had become soldiers, burned. Those Janissaries who attempted to flee the square were pursued through the streets of Constantinople. Those who surrendered were imprisoned. The subsequent trials moved with a briskness that suggested their conclusions had been determined in advance. Within hours, in the city of Constantinople, the Janissary Corps had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning entity. In the days that followed, the suppression extended beyond the capital. Janissary units across the empire, in the provincial cities, in the Balkan territories, in Egypt and Syria and Anatolia, were disbanded, their members dispersed, imprisoned, or executed, depending on the local circumstances and the degree of resistance they offered. The Bektashi Sufi order, so long the spiritual backbone of the Janissary identity, was simultaneously suppressed, its lodges closed, its leaders exiled, its rituals prohibited. Mahmud understood that the core and its faith were intertwined so deeply that eliminating one while leaving the other intact would be to leave an ember that could eventually reignite. The cauldrons, those great symbolic vessels around which the entire identity of the Brotherhood had been organized for 5 centuries, were confiscated and melted down. The Janissary Corps was formally abolished by imperial decree. Mahmud named the abolition the Vaka-i the auspicious incident. The name was chosen with a propagandist's precision. framing an act of mass institutional destruction as a moment of divine favor, a blessing visited upon the empire by a merciful God who had finally delivered his people from a corrupted and dangerous institution. Whether it was auspicious is a question that Ottoman history spent the next century quietly arguing with itself about. The empire that emerged from 1826 without its Janissaries was an empire free, at last, from the internal military veto that had paralyzed reform for 200 years. Mahmud was able, in the years that followed, to build the modernized military forces he had always intended. Forces trained along European lines, equipped with contemporary weapons, commanded by officers whose loyalty to the state was unambiguous. The empire's long military deterioration did not reverse overnight. But the fundamental obstruction to reversal had been removed. What had also been removed, however, was something less easily replaced than military effectiveness: the Janissary Corps, in its long corruption and political manipulation, had still been a living institution, one that carried within it, however obscured by centuries of institutional decay, the memory of extraordinary things, the memory of the breach at Constantinople, of Mohacs, of Chaldiran, of thousands of young men taken from Balkan villages and made into something that history had never seen before and would not see again in quite that form. When the barracks burned, that memory went with them in a way that is difficult to quantify but real to feel. History, over the 2 centuries since the auspicious incident, has treated the Janissaries with the ambivalence that complex institutions tend to earn. They were, in their finest period, a genuine military revolution, the first standing professional army of the medieval world, the force that introduced disciplined volley fire to battlefield tactics, the institution that proved, definitively, that a soldier made by training and belonging could be more formidable than a warrior made by birth and tradition. These are real achievements. They shaped the world. They were also, in their long decline, an object lesson in how institutions can become captured by their own survival instinct, how the desire to protect what was built gradually displaces the purpose for which it was built, until the institution exists, not to serve its original function, but simply to perpetuate itself. The Janissaries who murdered Osman II in 1622 were not protecting the Ottoman Empire. They were protecting the Janissary Corps. The distinction, which had once been meaningless because the two things were the same, had by then opened into a gulf wide enough to swallow a young sultan whole. But it is not with a decline that this story should end. It is too easy, and not quite honest, to let the last image of a great institution be its ruins. Think instead of the boy, the one standing in the foothills of some Balkan village in the early 15th century, watching Ottoman officials move along the road in the grey morning light. He does not yet know what is coming. He does not know the name of the city he will eventually serve. He does not know the language he will think in, the faith he will pray in, the brothers he will eat beside for the rest of his life. He knows his village, his family, the particular quality of light on the hills he has grown up under. That boy will become something the world has not yet imagined. He will march through the gap in walls that stood for 1,000 years. He will hear the Meher band play across the plains of Hungary and feel, in his chest, the particular steadiness that comes from knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you are for. He will eat from the shared cauldron and sleep in the shared dormitory and pray in the Bektashi way and belong completely to something larger than himself. He will be taken, and he will be made, and what he is made into will shake the known world for 5 centuries. The Janissaries are gone now. The barracks are gone. The cauldrons melted. The white felt caps preserved only in museums behind glass where visitors pause before them and try to imagine what it felt like to wear one into battle. The Bektashi lodges were eventually permitted to reopen in Turkey and in the Balkan nations where the order had always had its deepest roots, and the tradition survived. Quieter now, more contemplative, no longer the spiritual engine of an empire's most feared military force, but alive. The Ottoman Empire itself is gone, dissolved in the aftermath of the First World War into the modern Turkish Republic and the many nations that emerged from its former territories. The walls of Constantinople, Istanbul now, still stand in places. The Theodosian stonework, weathered but present, the breach through which the Janissaries poured on that May morning in 1453, long since repaired and built over by the ordinary accumulation of centuries. But history does not forget the things that genuinely changed it. And the Janissaries changed it. Changed the shape of empires, the nature of warfare, the boundaries of the world that followed them. They earned their permanence in the record, not through the accident of birth or the inheritance of power, but through 5 centuries of extraordinary, disciplined, deeply human service. Boys from the edges of an empire made into the center of it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything.